Okay, so today I'm going to be going over some corrective exercises and stretches that you can give to someone if they have an anterior pelvic tilt. So, with an anterior pelvic tilt, the first thing we want to do is essentially teach your client how to posteriorly rotate their pelvis. That way we can, get it back in a more proper alignment. So, the first thing we're going to do, you're going to have your client lie down on the ground with their back on the ground facing up. And you want to just check first and see the space that they have between their low back and the ground. So if you'll move your arm for a second. Right now you can kind of, well, you can't super tell, but there's some space right here between his low back and the ground. That's what we want to eliminate in this exercise. So what you're going to have your client do is essentially they're going to activate their core and work on gluing their low back down to the ground and eliminating that space, which is going to rotate the pelvis posteriorly back to where we want it out of that anterior position. You can do this for reps or for an extended period of time as an isometric hold. Okay, so for the next exercise, what we're going to do are some glute bridges. If you have like a bench to work with, that's probably the most ideal surface to use, but if not, like what we're using here, you can use the side of a bed, or if the height is right, maybe even the side of a chair or a couch. So essentially, the point in this movement is to work on strengthening the glutes and again, get the hips out of that anteriorly rotated position. So you're going to have your client set up with their shoulder blades off the edge of the bed or the bench or whatever surface you're using here. Their feet are going to be planted firmly on the ground, whole foot on the ground. And from here, where you're going to have them squeeze their glutes and raise their hips straight up. Now the key with this is you don't want to go too far and put them in an anteriorly rotated position. How we avoid that is by cueing them and making sure that while they're squeezing their glutes, they're not arching their low back too much. So he's doing a great job here of as he comes up to the extension, staying his body in a straight line rather than overextending. Okay, so for our next exercise, outside of just strengthening the glutes, another really important thing that we need to focus on in order to fix the anterior pelvic tilt is strengthening the abdominal muscles. Now, when we do this, you have to be sure that you're not asking your client to perform an exercise that requires them to use their hip flexors, because in this position, we typically already have very tight hip flexors. So we want to find a core exercise where the hip flexors are not being activated. And a great one for that is just going to be a plank. So you're going to have your client with on their elbows here, their feet are spread apart as you can see in the back, really squeezing your core in this movement. As you can see from this angle here, his body is in a straight line, which is exactly what we want. You don't want to see any, arching in the low back there, as we've mentioned on other exercises, because we're trying to remove that anterior pelvic tilt rather than exaggerate it. So again, a good flat back, really squeezing the core, activating those muscles, and strengthening them to help pull us out of that anteriorly tilted position. Okay, so outside of strengthening the glutes and the abdominal muscles, we also need to focus on stretching the hip flexors as well as the erector spinae, as those are muscles that in a client with an anteriorly tilted pelvis, those muscles are going to generally be pretty tight. So for this first stretch that we're going to talk about, we want to focus on stretching the hip flexors. So you're going to have your client set up in a half kneeling position with one knee up. It doesn't really matter which one they start with because you will do both sides, the other knee directly underneath them. From this position, we want to make sure we're keeping an upright torso, and you're going to have your client just shift their weight forward as if they're pushing their knee out over their toe. In this position, the client should feel a really good stretch in the back leg. The front leg is not the focus here, but we should feel a stretch in the front of the thigh, near the groin in that back leg. You'll hold it for just a couple seconds, just as he is here, and then rotate back to the starting position. Again, we want to make sure we do both sides. That way we're stretching the muscles on both sides and keeping good and balanced. The next exercise we are going to work on is the cat-cow exercise. So as I mentioned previously, while we want to stretch the hip flexors, we also want to work on stretching out the erector spinae. In the anteriorly tilted position, Again, that's a muscle that is typically very tight, so we want to work on stretching it out. So what you're going to do is you're going to have your client get in a quadruped position with their hands directly underneath their shoulders, their knees underneath their hips as we are here. From here, you want to have their client sink their low back down towards the ground as low as they can, followed by a movement in the opposite direction, moving their spine straight to the ceiling as high as they can. The key here is we want to make sure we're getting full range of motion. So as much range of motion as your client has. And this is going to be different from client to client, but as far as they can go, that's where we need to be pushing this movement to make sure we are getting that full stretch. For the last stretch we're going to focus on, we want to work on stretching the iliopsoas muscle. So for this exercise, you're going to have your client lay down on their back on the edge of a bed just as we are here. You want to make sure that their knees are draped over the corner of the bed with their feet hanging off the edge. If the feet do touch the ground, that's okay. Obviously, that's just going to be dependent on the height of your client, but as long as their knees are over the edge, that's the position that we want to start out in. From here, what you're going to have your client do is whichever leg, doesn't matter which one because we will do both, you're going to have them raise their leg up and bring it to their chest as close as they can to their body and just hold right there. As they hold it, you'll feel a stretch in the leg being stretched, of course, but you should also feel a stretch in the front of the thigh, close to the groin on the leg that is on the ground as well.